Hi. The purpose of this lecture is to initiate critical thinking about Hofstede's cultural dimensions, which has been introduced as a useful framework for understanding cross-cultural differences for communicative purposes. While Hofstede's theory can help us understand cultural differences and develop cultural communication skills to overcome those differences, it is not the only theory. Nor does it provide a comprehensive explanation for cultural differences. And some scholars have argued that it overgeneralizes cultural differences. So while we think Hofstede is a good start to assist you with developing cross-cultural understanding, we still need to reflect on what other scholars have said about cultural differences and identify potential problems in Hofstede's theory to avoid any possible mistakes like stereotyping or overgeneralizations. First, let's revisit the concept of culture. Remember, Hofstede defines culture as the collective programming of the mind which distinguishes the members of one human group from another. Culture, in this sense, includes systems of values, and values are among the building blocks of a culture. We also looked at a definition provided by Melanie Moll in her book, The Quintessence of Intercultural Business Communication. Her definition is, culture is the meaningful way in which people act and interact in their social context with one another. There are, in fact, many other definitions provided by numerous researchers, and it would be too difficult to cover them all here. But as some point out, a key term that appears in many definitions is the word programming. Some researchers believe that culture is not easily acquired and involves a slow process of growing into a society. This includes learning values, partaking of rituals, modeling against heroes, and understanding symbols. However, when reading theories that attempt to define culture and explain cultural behavior, such as Hofstede's cultural dimensions, it is important to contextualize how these definitions are framed. In other words, we need to identify the methods used to collect information and to understand the perspectives of the researchers and how they form their ideas. How do the researchers approach their study? What tools do they use to gather information? Are those tools appropriate and adequate to gather information to form a conclusive idea? And, most importantly, are the ideas presented in a theory generalizable across different settings or circumstances? First, let's talk about the method or tools for gathering information for Hofstede's theory. If you remember, his main method for gathering information was through questionnaires given to IBM employees working at different offices throughout the world. Some scholars argue that a weakness in Hofstede's theory is that he generalizes about the entire national population in each country solely on the basis of analysis of a few questionnaire responses. Others point out that because culture is not easily defined, we should ask, is Hofstede measuring the unmeasurable? That last question leads us to another point to consider when referring to Hofstede's cultural dimensions. We've already identified that culture is difficult to define because things like values and beliefs can vary and are not always visible to an observer, and because context and environments vary and can influence how an observer perceives and understands a culture. As I mentioned earlier, some critics point to the fact that Hofstede's analysis of the questionnaires suggests that workers at each IBM office represent the national culture in which they work in. Critics suggest that this is too simplistic. One way of looking at this argument is by looking at a statement like this. A group of IBM workers in France have a common set of values and beliefs and therefore represent all French culture. What is problematic about this statement? Well, first, I ask myself, can a group of workers in one office provide information on the entire cultural system of a country? I might then ask, who are these workers? Are they managers, computer programmers, assistants? How long have they worked at the company? What part of France do they come from? Have any of the employees ever worked in another culture or another country? There are many elements one can question this statement. Researcher Dr. Brendan McSweeney challenges Hofstede's theory in his paper, Hofstede's Model of National Cultural Differences and Their Consequences, a Triumph of Faith, a Failure of Analysis. He argues that Hofstede's theory is based on generalizations that do not fit neatly into every context. For example, he argues that many nations often have different ethnic groups, which are not typical of the national cultural identity. Another point to consider is how national identity and culture are related. Consider this. One might ask, do nations have a culture? Is there a national culture? What about national borders? Does a culture end at a nation's border? Some critics argue that nations are not the proper unit of analysis, as cultures are not necessarily bounded by borders. So when reviewing Hofstede's theory of cultural dimensions, one should consider the method and tools used for collecting information, how that information is analyzed, and whether findings from the analysis can be used to create a theory that explains something. There should then be careful consideration of whether a theory overgeneralizes. That said, Hofstede's research should not be ignored. His findings add value to our understanding of cultural behavior and, for the purpose of this course, cross-cultural communications. By reviewing and critically reflecting on his theory on cultural dimensions, you can use the knowledge to understand the following. Some scholars continue to argue for the relevance of his theory because there have been no significant studies on culture like his. Other studies have replicated similar findings, adding some validity to his generalizations, and that Hofstede has continued to update his data since the 1980s.